Welcome to the Dairy Farmers Digest, a podcast dedicated to all things dairy farming. Each episode, we will talk to industry leaders who share their insights and experiences into the dairy business. I'm your host, Keith Schweitzer, and I hope you enjoy this episode. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to the DFD podcast. I'm your host, Keith Schweitzer. Today is something I really enjoy talking about, and I'm going to get a little bit outside my depths when it comes to calves and calf nutrition, but we've got a great guest today in Aaron Keunen. So Aaron is one of the owners of Mapleview Agri here in Ontario. They are a milk replacer manufacturer, amongst other things, but Aaron, why don't you say hi and maybe give us a little bit of background on you and Mapleview?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Keith. It's a pleasure to get on here after saw 50 episodes, so that's impressive. Yeah, we've been in the milk replacer business since 2012. My family, my father Brian, has been raising cattle since 2001, and his grandfather my grandfather was a dairy farmer as well. So I've kind of grown up around agriculture. We still have around 2,000 head of cattle on feed, along with the milk replacer business, and then we have an animal health business as well. So yeah, excited to be on today and talk about something that I'm certainly passionate about.
Oh, that's excellent. I know about a year ago we got to tour your manufacturing facility and your research barn. So maybe just touch a little bit on what you guys do with the research barn. It's not too often that you come across these companies that are doing a lot of their own research with their own cattle. I know a lot of stuff is, university based, but to see what you guys are doing there is pretty exciting.
Yeah, so we have a facility with 4 rooms in it, segregated, with each housing 64 calves. So we actually just went through a recent renovation just to be able to monitor things a little bit differently on a little bit more of an intensive basis. So now we're able to track individual feed efficiency as well as water intake. So we have a water meter for each calf, and just monitor very closely as far as what kind of health outcomes we want to look for, feed efficiency, overall growth, overall health of the animals, and just finding ways to support what we're doing in the market. I think is something that we value, and it doesn't come without headaches and a lot of work. And growing pains to get to the point where we are now. Obviously, we made a large investment in the facility, but the things that we've been able to learn, how we've been able to adapt in the market and kind of be a leader in that sense, has been very, very exciting for us.
Yeah, I know you guys do a lot of work there on not only your own products, but I know you guys have done some outside trial work for other companies as well, which is definitely it's neat to see coming from a farm background, and you guys kind of getting over into a little bit more research, but still getting some of those practical results out of it. I know stuff with universities is always very controlled, and I know you guys do a lot of controls there too, but it seems like it's more of a commercial setting than maybe a research setting.
Yeah, certainly have probably more sample size than what you would see in more of an intensive situation such as a university, which I think is helpful when you're looking at outcomes such as overall growth. Just because of the deviation, when you have a smaller sample size, it's that much harder to find a statistical difference at the end. So just having the sheer numbers makes it also more challenging to get some of those intensive measures, whether it's taking it, I guess, one step further. So yeah, I would say from our perspective, we're looking at it as more of a feed them and weigh them kind of thing, and look at the big picture of health and performance and things like that.
That's good. But the reason I guess we got you on the podcast today is talk a lot about what's going on with calf health and some feeding programs and what you guys are seeing out in the countryside. I know every year kind of creates its different challenges. I was looking at my truck the other day and it was filthy dirty, and I got told by an old boy a long time ago that anytime your truck's dirty from going down a gravel road, it's not necessarily a great environment for calves. So it got me thinking about that over the last few days. And I know I've been hearing a bit of pneumonia challenges and some things that are coming off whether it be the weather change, or it could be calves born to heat stress, things like that, or a cumulative effect, I guess. But what are you kind of seeing out in the countryside these days?
Yeah, I think just from conversations with fellow farmers over the last couple of weeks, everyone's kind of saying the same things. Like, are you struggling with pneumonia? You get cold nights. Friday was 20 degrees, right? So we had a frost last night, and obviously it dropped below zero. So it's a challenging time of year. I think part of it is also, we've been building kind of bug pressure since last winter. There's been nothing to sort of kill it off. So just from a bug pathogen perspective, we've been kind of building, and then all of a sudden now we have a high load of bugs, but then we also have a stressor of a temperature change, potentially higher, moisture in the air, and then you get things cooling down, stuff like that. So it's a challenging time of year. There's no question about it, but I think we always kind of look forward to either being consistently cold or consistently warm. The up and down makes it super challenging.
Well, I know, like, just with the temperature change, like you're talking 20-degree swings in a day. We typically don't get that in the summer, unless you get some real scorcher days, but in some real kind of cooler nights. But that's typically more, I guess, reserved for the spring and the fall, where, like this morning, -4, -5, and a couple days ago it was 20 degrees. Like, it's just makes you pull out what hair you have left on your head to try and figure out some of this stuff with these calves. So
speak for yourself, Keith.
Yeah. So, like, in your kind of outlook on what you see, is there still a lot of talk, or a lot of people kind of weighing the options, I guess, on limit or ad lib feeding? Like, what's your perspective on that kind of thing right now?
I think it's always the perspective of what the farmer has in mind. Like, what are the goals? What are we looking to do, right? Are we looking to drive, as much pre-weaning growth as possible by hammering home as much milk as we can? Because then it's a different discussion than someone that, is feeding twice a day, only has a 3-liter bottle to work with, doesn't maybe have the labor or the system in place to get to that 3x feeding. So I think it all depends on, there's economic pieces in there too. You're front loading an investment for a potential return in first lactation. So I think, like, a lot of the discussions that we've been having with, fellow farmers, customers, whoever it may be, is I think you have to develop a program, not to stop at day 63, day 70, day 56, whenever you're weaning. We can push milk, we can push 14 liters at 28, 35 days and really drive home the milk. But then we also have to look at the weaning period. How much starter intake are we getting when we're feeding those really high levels? What does that do to our weaning period? So something that we've been kind of talking about is we should have basically a longer weaning period depending on how high you're going on milk. So if you're feeding 6 to 8 liters, you could probably wean them over 2 weeks, right? So we always kind of the rule of thumb would be 2 days of weaning for every liter of milk they max out at. If you're maxing out at 12 liters, we should be tapering them off for 24 days. If we max out at 8 liters, we should be tapering off for 16 days, kind of thing. So I think it's a greater discussion about, what are we looking to do and what are we working with as far as infrastructure, labor, those things.
So in your opinion, like, why does that, I guess, rule make sense? Like, is it just that transition from milk caloric intake to transitioning them onto starter? Like you just see these ad lib calves maybe eat a little bit more starter all the way through, and then some of these high plane of nutrition calves, like, and by high plane of nutrition, I mean large volumes of milk.
Yeah, I think the biggest piece is, like you said, you're offsetting calories with milk that, they might start searching a little bit younger for some of the grain, potentially some earlier rumen development, just because they are consuming grain, kind of looking for, they're a little bit more hungry. There's other conversations. What level of fat and energy are you supplying? Are you feeding whole milk? Because that's going to suppress starter intake a whole lot more than say a 20% milk replacer, just because the overall level of energy you're feeding, how they're feeling full. So I think it's basically you're getting them onto the starter a little bit later potentially in life, and just that rumen development piece. So if we want to get them onto starter or drive milk and get them onto starter quick, we just have to make sure the rumen's ready to handle that. They're consuming enough, they can process that and utilize it all before we pull them right off milk.
Yeah, I know that's it's always a dirty word around a dairy, or even any, like, even we've got a lot of integrated calf growers too. It's that transition off of milk onto solid feed is typically where we would see calves back off. And I think it's got better. It's still, depending on the situation, is maybe not great, but I think we've learned a lot over the past 10 to 15 years about, rumen development. I think in the past, you just thought, well, you feed the calf to get it big enough and then you wean it, just cut it off of milk and it's going to start eating calf starter. But then I think as we get into these higher genetic animals, like we're on a tipping scale, right? Like you can only push them so hard, and then all of a sudden you just pull the reins back on them or hit the brakes on them with milk, and then all of a sudden they're just not eating calf starter, and it takes them a few days.
Yeah, and I think another piece of it too is like you said, 10 or 15 years ago, you're managing things differently, probably feeding a lot less milk. So maybe you could get away with it by introducing starter a little bit earlier. But another piece was probably that the day that calf was weaned, it was being relocated to the next facility too, right? Put into a group with, heifers that were 400 or 500 pounds, 200 pounds. And I think we're doing a better job as an industry of kind of grouping animals, moving them together, bringing them into situations that aren't going to be super stressful post weaning, and maybe even leaving them, 2, 3, 4 weeks, ideally 4 weeks post wean in that, and then kind of move them as a group.
Yeah, and I know that's not easy to do in a lot of places. Like a lot of it's like, oh, let's get that hutch clean so we can get the next calf in there. And I think one of the biggest improvements, and I think you touched on a really great point there, is grouping, because I've seen the farms kind of grow over the years, and they were grouping, we're going to wean this week, we're going to wean 2-3 weeks worth of calves, and I'll move them at one time. So then you get a big group. And I've had a lot of farms switch to, groups of 8 or 10 after weaning, coming out of, say, like a hutch, and then going into a group of 8 to 10. And it just seems like that transition's way smoother.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think part of that too is you just don't have the stress of, having animals that are way bigger, way older, fighting for bunk space. There's so many different factors, diseases that, they've never been exposed to, all of a sudden, have to deal with.
Yeah. And I think a lot of times too, when they back off, when you kind of drop their caloric intake, like if they're not completely eating starter yet, I think you just open up a vector for disease. Like you cause a stress on that. So then all of a sudden, some of those underlying issues that maybe you're just feeding through, they had enough feed intake, whether it be from milk or starter, they just kind of got through. But when you take that nutrition away from them, I think it just kind of hammers on their immune system a little bit. And you see some of those pathogens kind of rear their ugly head, like especially with things like doubling around. Like it really makes me concerned that this transition period, because it's one of those diseases that, yeah, it could affect a young calf, but it seems like anytime there's a stress event, that's when doubling kind of rears its ugly head. So
yeah, and I think, like you said, as the farms get larger, and even honestly for some of the smaller farms, I'm encouraging producers to find a way to kind of mimic an all in, all out the best they can. So if they're on a computer feeder, let's take 2-3 weeks worth of calves, fill that side, maybe have 4 quadrants, fill a quadrant every 2-3 weeks, let them kind of stay stable, move them together. I think that's something that in our industry with the calf rearing side of things, you're bringing calves from 30-40 different dairies, mix in some auction calves, you're bringing them all into one place. If we do that every week, we're going to have nothing but issues. So what we try to do is basically you fill a facility every 4 weeks, 4 to 5 weeks, and then you would fill it again 4 to 5 weeks later, just so you can get them in, get them stable, make sure they're healthy and going before you're introducing anything else. And I think that's where we're seeing a lot of issues, is just constantly introducing new calves, introducing new stressors, bugs, whatever it may be. So I know it's always a question of infrastructure and labor, and those all play for sure, but it's just, with what we have at our facility, how can we somewhat mimic that, I think is an important consideration.
Well, and the dairy is an interesting one because, like, if you look at, hog production or chicken production, 99% of them are all in and all out. Like, even when it comes to like nurseries or even just chicks going into a new barn, like there's no way that a chicken farmer would have the barn half full of 6-week olds and then put a bunch of chicks in there, because you're just cruising for disaster. And I think on dairy we can learn maybe some of these things from the other industries that kind of cross that bridge between us, where we're all still dealing with young animals, and they all have, it doesn't matter, you're talking to a hog producer or a dairy producer or chicken producer, like all the bad things happen when you've got young animals.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's not certainly not an easy thing to conquer on a dairy. But yeah, just finding ways to somewhat mimic that, I think is kind of where it starts. And then if you're looking at building new facilities, expanding, whatever the case may be, then that's when you really need to kind of, hone in on how do we do this properly.
Yeah. And I think that's the point too, is that it's very difficult on dairy because we're in a continuous production cycle, right? Where some of these other ones are, everything's so geared towards logistics on the processing end of things, and that all just filters all the way back down through the system, where dairy, like we're always calving cows and we're always drying cows off. Like the production cycle just never stops. So we have a unique set of challenges, and with the amount of money it costs to build now, like it's really hard to do everything perfectly. So
and like you said, when the chickens leave, when the pigs leave, they're probably washing out, they're probably disinfecting, they probably have a downtime period, right? And you look at the calving area, you look at the, even where the calves are, whatever the case may be, even when we're cleaning, there's likely to be, animals going back in that day or the next day after, right?
mm-hmm.
And I think that's something that we also try to do a little bit differently on kind of the production calf side, is leaving downtime. So even if, you're not, you're washing, disinfecting, but, for that cycle to stop, you need everything to dry out. You need to give it a break, give it a rest, and then, maybe a week later, fill it back up. So something that we've seen some producers kind of start to move towards is, for example, having a calving area, you calve out for 2 weeks while the other area is empty. Then you would start to calve on the other area, and then kind of back and forth that way, just to kind of help the load down. Because I think even if we can't eliminate it all, let's just find a way to keep the pressure down during those high risk periods. So
yeah, it's just because it's so much money involved in making infrastructure work for you. It's just like, we don't see producers building a ginormous dry cow facility for that single purpose, because I don't think the dollars aren't there on the other end to make it work. But you see lots of producers getting very creative with, managing their calving pens and things like that. Like they're using lots of group penning where, for the calvings for this week go into this pen, and the calvings for the next week go into that pen. And I wouldn't say they're cleaning them out by any means, but there's always, fresh straw going in there, and they're making sure. You see lots of producers with little areas in like the corner of their calving pen where they've got a quarter of a bale feeder in the corner, and then you see a calf, they dump it in there. Or, lots of producers have wheelbarrows and things by the calving pens now where, that calf hits the ground, it gets thrown in the wheelbarrow, and then at least the cow can get at it. And you're limiting the amount of pathogens, I guess, that animal can pick up from the pen. So
yeah, no, I think that producers are definitely aware of it, and always improving, always finding ways to do it differently for what works for their own operation.
Yeah, and I've been around the industry just a little bit longer than you, and it's one thing that, it used to be where producers never produce enough heifers for their own, and there was always, they were always buying in, and at the time, like, they could buy larger chunks of quota, things like that, so they could expand a little bit more rapidly. But one thing that I've noticed over the years is our heifer inventories have really grown, and it's not necessarily because our industry's grown. I think producers have just done a way better job of keeping the calves that do hit the ground alive. doing little management things like that and making sure that they're getting fed right in their early life stages and make sure they get transitioned well into the next production phase. So
Yeah, and I think there's probably been a greater focus on the calf in the last 10, 15 years, just because people are understanding the value of it and what it means down the road. What we do now in the pre-weaning phase, how does that affect the first, second, third lactation, right? So I think it's always a question of economics, right? You're spending this time and this money early on. What are we going to see later? And I think there's now numbers to validate that you are going to see a return. And I think there's new people coming in the industry. I mean, Dr. Anil, Mike Steele, Dr. Trevor DeVries. I mean, guys like that. They're investing time, energy, money. I mean, us as a company, it's the same thing. We're collaborating with the university numerous times in the year to work on new projects and actually get the dollars and cents and how does it affect the overall health of the animals and how can we, raise better heifers for that production period, right? So I think just the education and the money being spent and invested in the industry and the young calves it's been remarkable over the last 5 years specifically, and potentially even out to as far as 10 years. So
yeah, I think you're right. I think producers have looked less of heifer raising as a cost and more as an investment in their future, which is it's a really good mentality shift. And I see it a lot with beef breedings too, because people are cognitive of not trying to they're trying to limit their size of their heifer herds because it is bloody expensive to feed them all the way for 22, 23, 24 months until they calve in and they can start paying you back a little bit. But it's one of those things where producers are more than willing to spend the money in the right places if they can see a return at the end of the day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's where we need to go. I think it's long overdue that we've kind of got to that point where we're not making decisions based on now. We're making decisions based on what's the future of our herd, what's the future of our business or operation. I mean, the farms are getting bigger. There's a lot of money at stake now, and I think that we need to understand what we're doing and being responsible with these young stock, just so that we can see a return later on.
Just to kind of circle back on feeding, like in Aaron's perfect scenario, what would you see like a A1 feeding program for a calf these days, whether it be replacer or whole milk?
Yeah, I kind of touched on it earlier. I mean, it's a hard question to answer because I think there's two types of feeding. I mean, you have your grain-fed veal market, you have your dairy cross market, you have your replacement heifer market. So I think for me, there's probably 2 or 3 different feeding methods that would be kind of my go-to. And because I don't always think necessarily if you're looking at an animal that's going to be harvested in 15 months, front loading that investment, might potentially look different than a dairy replacement heifer that you're going to be seeing for 6-8 years potentially in your herd. So if I guess we'll start with the replacement heifer. If it's a replacement heifer, I think that an ad lib feeding, once you get through the first 2-3 weeks, I think sometimes mistakes are made in the first 2 weeks by trying to, hammer in 10 liters when realistically, let's just keep this calf healthy. Let's keep it drinking, let's get it through kind of the high risk, potentially diarrhea period around 7 to 10 days. I don't think you're necessarily going to drive substantially more growth by feeding, say, 10, 12 liters in the first 2 weeks. So kind of feeding more of 6 to 8 liters for the first 2 weeks and then increasing them up to sort of an ad lib for 2-3 weeks, somewhere around that 10, 12 liters. And then I'm an advocate for a nice, long weaning, I would say, probably 21 to 28 days, weaning them around day 70. That's probably where I would go with a dairy replacement feeding system. Whereas if you're looking at for the grain-fed veal market or for the dairy cross market, I'm probably more likely to max out somewhere around that 8 liters during that kind of 3 to 6 week period, and then trying to get them weaned kind of at 8 weeks, at the latest kind of 9 weeks. So just kind of monitoring, how much are we are we driving into the animals that are going to be harvested for the meat market? Yeah, I don't necessarily know if you see a return by feeding ad lib milk, potentially delaying weaning and rumen development and those kind of things, just to get a few quick easy pounds on the milk replacer. So that's kind of always my goal, and I think, and potentially even other situations, guys are trying to wean them even quicker, whereas I'd be tempted to take them out to 56, 63 days on the meat animal, and then on the replacement heifer, I would think by 70 days is probably a comfortable age to get them weaned.
Yeah, I know on the veal and the beef cross stuff, like it's one of those things, like you have to weigh the economic values, but you can also put pretty cheap gain on those calves at that time, through milk and starter intake, because they are so feed efficient, up to the first 90-ish days like that, it kind of starts to taper off. But, that first 100 days, like you can really put some pounds on those animals in that time if you have a really good feeding program.
Absolutely. And I think then, I think there's a few other factors in the equation. I think looking at, do we sacrifice a week of yardage value because that animal's staying a week longer because we fed them less milk? But what did we potentially save to feed less milk to get those pounds out of grain? I mean, you're looking at milk at, say, $4 a kilo, looking at grain at, 35 to 50 cents a kilo. At a 3-to-1 versus a 2-to-1 feed efficiency. But, so obviously you can put those pounds on a little bit cheaper, but with less pounds means more yardage. So there's so many things that factor in the equation. So I would say I would take kind of like a moderate to high milk as a standard for the meat industry. But I do think if you can have, I think you need enough milk to keep that animal healthy, to have it, big enough when you go to move it to the next facility too, right? So it's definitely a balance and more of an economic decision based on today rather than later or in the future.
Yeah, and that kind of changes. Like, I know sometimes milk or milk replacer gets real expensive and other times it's not. So I think you can kind of change your tune a little bit depending on the economic drivers, like within the industry, I guess, and
absolutely
make it work, right? So,
and I mean, there's different discussions too, right? I mean, right now you have a $700-800 calf.
Yeah.
2 years ago we had a $50 calf, right? So, your investment looks a little bit different probably, depending on some of those other factors as well.
Yeah, I know I've kind of heard the calf market maybe backed off a little bit, but who knows? It could be back up next week too. Depends on who's buying, but that really changes your thought process when you're looking at that day old calf, and like in a week you could be $700-800 in my pocket. Like
yeah, it depends what side you're looking at. The buyers are definitely thinking the calves are pretty expensive, and the sellers are happy. So
yeah, and I mean that calf price is following all the way through right now, which is good because they need it when they're buying expensive calves like that. But
yeah, I think there's always a risk too. We're 16 months away from marketing that calf too, right? So
yeah,
it's a risk that the calf producers are taking.
With the veal and the cross calves, I know some people have been talking about plasma and milk replacer. Now, do you see that on dairy replacement heifers as well, or is that kind of more of a economic driver on animals that are destined for the meat or for meat?
Yeah, I think that functional proteins or plasma, I think there's absolutely a place in dairy replacements. I think there's a place in veal and beef calves. The biggest reason that we would advocate for it would be kind of high stress situations. So you're essentially supplying IgG at a lower level. So the IgG of the animal plasma is around 16 to 18%. So you're still getting an immune response, and there's still some value as far as the health goes. And the other benefit to it is you're not necessarily sacrificing any gain. So we've done a few different studies just internally, that a few of them actually published in JDS, but we didn't see any difference in growth. So you're not going to see an improvement in growth, but you're not going to see less growth either. So from a feed efficiency perspective, everything was the same. So realistically, you're probably bringing plasma into the scenario for more of the health benefits, and then also as an interchangeable kind of milk protein as well. So there's definitely times where plasma is a premium to add into milk replacer, and there's times where it pulls in cheaper. So it can be used in any situation. I don't necessarily think there's always necessarily a need for it, but I think that it's definitely one of the most widely used, additive, we'll call it, across North America when it comes to calves and improving health and performance.
Yeah, how long has it been around? Like I think I maybe started hearing about it 5-6 years ago. I don't know if it's been around longer than that or if it's relatively novel or.
Yeah, it's been around. Oh, that's a good question. I'll have to circle back to you on that one, Keith. But it's certainly been around for quite a while. I know the calf industry in the U.S. has been using it for years and years. I think it's something like 50% market share on calf ranches in the U.S. So it's definitely the most used additive in the U.S. It's just recently come to Canada. We started selling some products with it. Probably been 3-4 years now, and seeing great success on especially on the calf ranch type customers. And we also have quite a few dairies that are buying in as well. And it's just it's an education piece. It's not something that everyone's used to seeing. I mean, you look at the tag and it says, it's a 26 protein, 22% from milk sources, and 17% fat. And right away they think, for years, everyone's been telling me that non-milk proteins are a no-go, right? So it's just a conversation about, it's not necessarily a milk protein, but it's as good, if not superior to the milk protein at that point at a very low rate, right? It's only in the formula at 5%. So you're not displacing a lot of the milk protein, but it's not to a detriment. It's not to be cheaper. It's to actually improve overall health.
No, and I think if you look back years ago when it came from a non-milk source, like you're kind of questioning, like, where's it coming from and can a calf digest it and things like that. Like there was more questions than answers. And it was just, I think it was pretty new and not really a commercial, like it wasn't known about in the industry, right? So people kind of questioned it a little bit, but it just seems like, especially with these integrated growers, calf growers, your veal and your crossbred beef guys, like it's seeing more prevalence in the market, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's from all of our calf type grower customers, I would say 90% of them are on a functional protein product. And then we're not marketing any wheat, soy, stuff like that. So I think it just kind of goes to show, when a producer makes a decision to try something, are they sticking to it? And I think that's, for us, a good indicator that it's obviously working in the market. So
I want to shift gears maybe a little bit here. And what are the perspectives, I guess, on the future of raising surplus calves? Like, do you see any issues with retail markets or processing or consumer acceptance or anything like that? Like what's your kind of view? Because I know you guys are in that business as well. So
yeah, I sit on the veal board as a board member. So this is something that we certainly have discussions about all the time, right? Like it's historically that's been a market for a Holstein calf, and now we have crossbreds in the picture as well. So I think as an industry, I think we're doing a good job of making sure that we have a market for these animals. And I think, as a veal producer, I'm proud that we've been able to do that. I could almost say single-handedly, help with that issue for the past 10, 15 years. But I also think that, I personally, I'm not speaking on behalf of the veal board, I personally think that there's a place for the crossbred calf too, right? And and potentially, at times of the year when the veal calves are in less demand, or the same time the beef calf is in high demand, right? So I think they can complement each other, and I think it's a benefit to the dairy industry to have both the veal industry there as a partner and the crossbred industry, as the beef industry as a partner too. So I think it's important that we don't focus too much on one or the other. From my perspective, I think we need to endorse both, right? Because they're both a market, and I think it's good for the dairy industry to have that. It tells a good story, and I think the consumer wants to know that every piece on the farm is working, and obviously that's a piece that in the past potentially didn't work as well as it could have. So I think welcoming both industries is really important.
Yeah, and it's amazing on how many crossbred calves you see, like just talking to producers in the countryside, and a lot of their breeding programs now are based heavily, like you hear producers breeding 60% of their herd to beef and 50%, and there's still some producers that aren't breeding hardly any animals to beef, but it's amazing when you go around and see all these crossbred calves, and then just the stinking value that they're bringing in right now. And part of that is market demand. Like there's been a lot of drought through the Central Plains in the US and Canada, through the prairies, and the cow herd, like the beef cow herd, has really just been decimated. Like they've had record calls in 2022, and it looks like 2023 isn't going to be far off that. So it's like, where are we going to get our replacement animals for the feedlots? Right. And the dairy producer said, "Hey, look at me over here. We can do it."
Yeah. And I definitely think there's a place for it. Yeah. I guess I would maybe turn the question around a little bit to you, Keith. Like at what point, as an advisor on the farm, at what point, do we see a potential where, fresh heifers get really expensive? So, producers are more likely to reintroduce more Holstein calves into the herd again. And then what happens with those animals when, we're now making more Holstein calves, and we've maybe shifted away from the veal industry because we were servicing the crossbred industry and sort of decimated that in the supply of calves there. Like, is there a point where you think that producers will actually shift back from the 60% to doing more Holsteins and, potentially less sex semen, or whatever the case may be? But is there a point where that sort of tips?
I think we've seen it already. I think maybe 6-8 months, a year ago, I think producers maybe went to the far side of that. And we haven't really seen a drop in heifer inventory per se, but I think it's a 2-year cycle, right? So we could be at the beginning of that. Like, so you breed a dairy animal January, calves out October, we're still another 22 months, 2 years before that animal hits back in the milking line. And I think we're just at the early stages where producers maybe went a little too far, and they're just kind of brought it back a little bit. And you kind of see that, like I'm seeing it in fresh cow prices, like for the last, I'm no good, I have no concept of time sometimes, but I'm going to say at least the last 2 years, like fresh cow prices haven't really dropped below that $2,400-$2,500 for average ones. Like you've always got your ends of the spectrum where you're going to have some duds, and you're almost better off to put them straight in the beef line, but they are still getting sold as a fresh animal. And maybe you're only going to get $1,800 for her. But then on the other hand, we're going to see $3,500 for the real good ones. But I think on average, like you hear guys talking that are selling fresh animals, 25, 26, $3,000 still. And especially for this time of year, that's, I'd say, on the high side. And I just wonder if, I don't know where these animals are going, whether they're going down the US, or they going to Quebec, or they staying, locally here in Ontario. I can't tell you that, but I just know that the value has kind of stayed up a bit on them, when typically this time of year we start to see those values drop a bit. So I think that, like, back to your original questions, I think producers had got to that point already and kind of drew back in a little bit, but it's relatively new that producers are doing this, and it took a big mindset shift on it. And so I think people are just trying to kind of feel that out, where their happy medium is on how many replacements they should have on the farm. But time will tell, I guess. I could be wrong on the on whether producers hit that wall or not, but just my sentiment from talking to producers in the countryside is that. So
I guess the question is how much profit is in that fresh heifer, right? At what point does that fresh heifer actually become profitable enough that, you know, getting a little bit of a premium on your beef calf at birth, you know, does that ever offset, I guess? And that's probably, you know, dependent on feed costs and, you know, yardage costs, infrastructure, all those pieces, right?
And that's the question, because like if you look at a few, like a week old or 10-day old beef calf, and you're going to get $700 for her, and you've got very little work, there's a lot of margin in that. I don't know if you can recapture that margin later in life by time you've taken on the death loss and fed the thing and housed it and yardage. Like, is that yardage that you're going to keep a 2-year-old or keep a heifer around that you're just going to sell a surplus? Would it be better spent to either maybe say raise some cross calves up to 1,000 pounds and then sell them into a feedlot? I don't know that. I my gut feel is that you might be better off to do that. But if every producer jumped on the bus and did that, there'd definitely be way more value in the replacement heifer. So
Right.
it's just going to be a balance, right? Like the thing that I've had this conversation with producers before, and with the beef, like if you want to raise the beef, you got to realize like that turnaround's a lot quicker than what you would have on a fresh heifer. Like if you're marketing a fresh heifer to a sales barn that's gonna sell it, you know, you're looking at, if you're going to take it to 1,000 pounds, you're probably looking at 11, 12 months of age, and you're going to get a check for where it'd be 22 months. So it's a little bit, I would think, maybe more advantageous on a cash flow perspective for a producer to keep the replacement, or maybe keep your replacements that you need on farm and then raise those extra beef calves, because your turnaround on them is going to be half of what it would be to sell a fresh heifer to a sales barn, right? It's an interesting question. And from the outside looking in at the US market, like they are very much more, we're only going to keep what we need. The rest is going to get bred beef. And I think there's some good little revenue streams for that, from their perspective, because the calves are valued at more if they want to keep them. A lot of times they don't, because the highly intensive dairy areas, usually land's too expensive to feed them. Like they don't want to grow extra forage or feed. They're better off to sell them at a week old and send them to Kansas or Colorado or Texas to where they can feed them and raise them a little bit cheaper. So
Right. And I think that makes sense.
Yeah. It's an interesting thought process or question too, right? Like not every producer is going to have the room to keep their beef calves back, because, you know, we've got to raise our dairy replacements. And the question is, should we build another barn just so we can put beef calves in it? Or do we keep them for 10 days and make a bunch the same margin with zero work?
Right, exactly. And are we crowding our heifers and everything else that goes along with it by feeding them for that extra, you know, $300-400 in potential margin?
Yeah. And I have clients that are raising replacement heifers and things like that. And they've got the barn space to do it. They've got, you know, people that are buying their calves regularly, you know, calling up every week or every couple of weeks or once a month and saying, hey, you got some animals for us, because I know this might go over like a lead balloon, but when people talk about $3,000 to raise a heifer, I don't think it's that expensive. I think it's probably a little bit more than it was, but I think you can have them calved out, and you got to realize you get the calf out of that animal too. So there's a little bit of either as a replacement heifer or a beef cross on that. So once you freshen it out, you still get that calf too. So there's some margin there. But I think most heifer rearing programs that I've put together for people, and we've done budgets on them, are anywhere from $200 to $2,400, depending on if they're feeding replacer and how much calf grain and what is their transition programs on those calves look like. Like there's a lot of different ways to feed those animals. And I guess at the end of the day, you just got to put pencil to paper or get somebody like me to kind of click around on an Excel spreadsheet to see, you know, what it is our actual cost production on it, because you can
Yeah,
say
you're
one
more
thing.
likely to shoot high.
Yeah,
When you're budgeting, when you're making a decision, you're more likely to
yeah.
always
Like,
make sure that you're covered, right?
and when I do stuff like that, like we use cash values on forages and things like that, and producers are raising forages on a cost production. And I know, like within our own group, like there's a big discussion around some of that stuff, but just my perspective or point of view is like, if you're growing double crop things and things like that, like it's just not as expensive to grow. And it's relatively cheapish forage. So, there's a little bit of margin kind of built into that. But I always price stuff high as a worst case scenario. And if you can do it at the worst case scenario, you can do it at the best case scenario. So
Right. A little
yeah.
stress test.
Yeah. Yeah. Was there anything else coming down like the calf pipeline that is new or exciting in your world?
I think we've come out with some pretty neat products on the gut health side. Looking at a product called lactoferrin. So lactoferrin is found in colostrum, and it helps. It's a glycoprotein. It binds iron. But we saw some really nice responses in overall gut health and villi health. So just being able to kind of maintain nutrient absorption following a stress challenge. So by offering lactoferrin at the onset of diarrhea, we were able to see a nice improved growth response 8 weeks out after the diarrhea challenge. So I'd have to look back exactly, but I think it was roughly 8 pounds of additional gain by offering the lactoferrin. So that's something neat that we've come out, and I think that probably ties into the colostrum discussion. And I know it's been a large discussion lately. I mean, I was at the American Dairy Science Association meeting, and there's posters everywhere on colostrum, and as an industry, we're investing a lot of time and money, and I think that's a great spot to put that. And so lactoferrin and colostrum is obviously at a high level. So is it one of the key components that we're able to isolate to see some of the same benefits? And then looking at colostrum as a whole, I think it's definitely something that as a company we're looking at. Where does it fit? How long can we feed it? How much do we need to feed to see those responses from a commercialization perspective, rather than just solely looking at what's the benefit of feeding half colostrum, half milk for the first two weeks. Like, at what point do we not see that response? How much can we get away with? Because there's if you want to spend $200 worth of colostrum, by feeding it at that level, does that make sense, rather than feeding it at a more moderate level and still seeing the same responses? So those are some of the areas that we're focusing on right now. We've done some oral rehydration work that we published, looking at different buffers, different sugars. So glucose absorption versus maltodextrin absorption in the gut in an electrolyte. So we saw that glucose was absorbed within an hour of administration, whereas maltodextrin was absorbed kind of over a 24-hour period. So we've kind of made some changes to some of our offerings based on this type of work. Those are kind of the more immediate stuff. We do have some trials going on right now looking at fat levels in milk replacer as well. It's been a hot topic in academia, and I think there's hypothesis out there that may not mesh exactly with what we see as from a practical level on body weight gain, grain consumption. We talked about high plain nutrition milk feeding 10-12 liters at high fat levels. What kind of suppression are we seeing? And we're going to be coming out with some numbers to show, so basically what we're looking at is a 17% fat, a 24% fat, and then a 31% fat. And we'll have body weight numbers, we'll have overall health and performance, water intake, grain consumption. So I think that's kind of new and exciting. And I think from there, we'll be able to kind of develop or continue to sort of validate some of the products that we have out there, and doing, what's best for the farmer, what's best for the calf as a result.
Well, I always find the fat thing interesting because in Europe, they're always kind of higher fat, lower protein. North America, we're higher protein, lower fat. And I just don't know. I don't know what's right.
Yeah. And I think so our trial that we did was 128 calves, and then we had the 3 treatment groups. And we did see some, we're just kind of analyzing the data now, but just kind of looking at it from a numerical perspective. We did see some suppression in starter intake to go to the 31, like a significant amount of starter suppression. And so kind of, a 31% dry matter fat is similar to where whole milk would be. Whole milk would be a little bit higher in the medium chain fatty acids. So, there's the question of if that comes into play as well. But basically by offering too much fat in a climate controlled facility, so 15 degrees, we did see starter suppression. We saw less water intake and less overall gain. And so then it's the question of, are you seeing reduced rumen development because of that starter intake suppression? How does that all fit? So I think that'll be some really cool data that we'll have probably in the next 6 months. And then looking at, do we need to increase it? And then I think it kind of leads into another discussion about, okay, too much, and 24 is kind of okay, but maybe a little bit high. Then do we need to tailor it in a little bit more? Look at, a 17, a 19, and 22, or 17, 20, 22, whatever the case may be. And because the other question about it is looking at osmolarity. So when you have more fat and you have more protein, you lower osmolarity. And that's another factor on how does that affect, gut health and things like that. So those are some of the things that we still need to tease out. Are we seeing, less days with abnormal fecal scores by feeding a higher fat? Those are questions that I don't have answers to, but we hope to kind of come up with in the next 6 months.
Yeah, that question always interests me because I know, like, just looking at herds that are on whole milk, like they don't get the starter intakes, but they get growth. So
yeah, and the question is what type of growth is that, right?
Yeah.
Is that creating butterballs, or is that creating, nice lean heifers?
Yeah. I don't mind a little butterball at that stage of life. So coming from the father of two kind of chunky babies. So but at the end of the day, does it make sense for, you're right, like where's that growth coming from? Are we getting good skeletal and lean muscle growth, or are we getting, round little squatty heifers? But I've seen some pretty tremendous results off guys that are feeding whole milk. So I don't know. And I guess at the end of the day, it's got to fit your production system and your labor and everything else that goes on the farm too, right? So
that's a whole nother podcast there, Keith.
Oh, I would love to get into that someday and just get two people on either side and just mediate that. Sit back and enjoy.
Yeah, that would be entertaining.
Was there anything else that you could think of with calf raising and things like that you're seeing out there right now?
Not particularly. I think we kind of touched on the majority of it. I think somewhere that I'm interested in is finding a way to just mitigate that disease transfer on dairies, because as the pathogens get stronger, I mean, Salmonella Dublin. So we got a trial going on right now looking at calves with prevalence of Salmonella coming in, and then the number of calves leaving with titers for Salmonella Dublin. So I think that'll be really cool to see kind of, what level are we actually seeing within the industry locally in Ontario, and what effect does that have on the overall health of the calves. But those are some of the things that I think that's where it ties into, just mitigating transfer by trying to do all in, all out the best we can with what we have, and understand that's another discussion too. It's easy to spend other people's money, but just with what we can, how can we sort of mitigate those risks? Because I honestly don't think that the dairies in Ontario have struggled with Salmonella Dublin like, the veal producers and some of the farms that are commingling, especially closed herds. And I think that's where some hard lessons might come down the road. And so the question of how can we mitigate those risks?
Well, I know when farms do get it, it's a hard lesson, because usually you don't know what it is, and then all of a sudden you get the test back and you've lost a bunch of calves already. And I've seen it, bigger animals too, 400 or 500 pound animals where they're going backwards. So it's not just affecting the babies. And I think you're right too. Like, I think the next level for producers on the calf rearing is just that health around the first, 3 to 5 days. You get them through that first week of life, without being unscathed, and those things just take off. You don't really have to
Mhm.
worry about them as much, you know. I mean, you get your crypto, your coxies and things like that, but if I mean,
For pickup.
after a week, you're generally not quite in the clear, but you're less clear than you were 3 days earlier. So thanks, Aaron. I guess we'll wrap the podcast up there. It's been great having you on and kind of sharing your insights and your experiences into your guys' business. I know you guys do a great job with your product offering and do a great service for the veal and the beef and the dairy industries here in Ontario. And I truly appreciate you guys coming on the podcast today.
Well, I appreciate this podcast, Keith, and appreciate you bringing me on. It was a pleasure to talk about obviously something that I'm passionate about and something that I like to hear people's challenges and kind of discussion around it and see if we can move things forward and find better ways of doing things.
Thanks again, Aaron, and we'll talk to you later.
Thanks, Keith. Take care.
Thanks for listening. This episode of the Dairy Farmers Digest is brought to you by the dairy team at Waldstein Feed and Supply Limited. If you enjoyed the show, subscribe and follow us on your favorite podcast player, and please leave us a review. If you would like further information about today's topic, check out the show notes for further details and our contact information. I would also like to extend a special thanks to Christine Schoonerwood, our producer, and our sound engineer, Daniel Noguera.